many of you have had an opportunity to watch the History Channel's series called Alone? Any Alone? Boy, it may not make it another season with that kind of response. Hey, so Alone has this one goal. It is about, they take 10 contestants who are survivalists. They drop them in a wilderness, okay, by themselves. It's solo. And the whole deal is they have to see who can stay out there the longest. And the person who stays out there the longest gets $500,000. Not a bad deal, right? Now, they don't have any connection with one another. And unlike some of the other Survivor shows, there's no cameraman, that there's no set-up dramatic moments. They are their own cameraman. And so what you see happening is what's really, really, truly happening. They are able to take like 10 items out. I was watching just the front end of the first episode. There's a guy named Sam, and Sam says, "I'm not fearful. I'm not scared. I've been waiting for this moment, preparing for this moment all my life." Another bearded wonder named Chris says this, "Hey, we get to take 10 items, basically, along with us to survive, and our opportunity, our chance for survival is primarily based on our choice of those 10 items." Another guy, as they're helicoptering him in to his drop-off place in the wilderness, looks at the camera and he just says this, "I don't want to tap out. I want to be ready and I want to win." Well, we're in this series the last few weeks called Daniel, Profile in Courage. And we are in chapter 6. And chapter 6, if you're familiar with it, contains an amazing story that, although I haven't done research on this, I would say is possibly one of the top 5 best-known stories in the Bible. People sometimes who don't even know really the Bible understand or have heard this story. It is the topic of many devotionals. It has been even the topic of a lot of halftime talks by coaches to their team, trying to get them ready for the second half, right? It is something that has been used in sermon after sermon after sermon. It is all about Daniel and the lion's den. Most of the time, when we hear devotions, when we hear a pep talk, when we hear a Sunday school lesson, when we hear a sermon, basically the theme of this is this: Daniel's big win in the lion's den. That just kind of covers it all. And pretty much the lesson will always be this: you can count on it. Will you be brave when you're in your lion's den? That's probably the bottom line. So I was reading this the other day. I was reading the chapter. I try to read the chapter over and over as I begin to prepare the sermon. And as I was reading this, I realized, you know what? This really isn't about a guy who gets thrown in a lion's den. That's a part of it. But it's really not the target of the chapter. It's really about a guy who spends his life getting ready for the lion's den. Then I was driving down the road the other day, and I wasn't even thinking about my sermon, but all of a sudden, I kind of had this thought come to my mind. I will blame it on the Holy Spirit. And it was even kind of a further on. This isn't just about a guy getting ready for that moment in the lion's den. This is a guy who is spending his life and has spent his life getting ready for what we might call draining days. Draining days, days that make us vulnerable, days that stretch us, days that bring temptation to our life. And chapter 6, it is about this man named Daniel. And as he writes the book, he is sharing with us, here's some situations he found himself in, and here's his training schedule. Here's how he had prepared for that. And so in some ways, it's really not that much different from the series Alone. It's really all about you and I asking ourselves, are we ready? Because the winner is the one who is ready. So I want to ask you to open your Bibles if you would, okay? Or open your Bible app if you have that, all right? And we're going to look down through this. Let me kind of show you what I mean here. Chapter 6 really begins actually at the last verse of chapter 5. I don't know why they put 6 where they did, because it's a continuation of what happened in chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 31 says this, "And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces. He appoints a high official to rule over each province." With me? So the king also chose, it says, Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators. This is kind of a story that we've heard before. And high officers, because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. So there's a couple things that we need to know from this passage we just read. One, you're going to recognize that this is a new king. Matter of fact, from Nebuchadnezzar, it's the 3rd king. We had Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Then we had, as Jim shared last week, a story about a man by the name of Belshazzar, who was king, all right? Okay, and just so you'll know, all right, gets confusing. Belshazzar was the king. Belteshazzar was Daniel's Babylonian name, and those you can get them kind of confused. So we have Nebuchadnezzar, we have Belshazzar. Now we have a whole nother kingdom, basically, that's come in, taken over the Babylonian Empire, the Medes, and a man by the Darius is now the king. So Daniel has been basically highly exalted by all 3 of these kings and their kingdoms. Second thing I want you to know is this, that when we started Daniel in chapter 1, if you remember, Daniel was, we decided, about probably 17 to 20 years old. We did not know that for sure, but he was a young man. At this stage in chapter 6, he is about 80 years old. That's important to know. He has spent most of his life with these 3 kings serving and being exalted. And by the way, and we don't know this, sometimes people say, so what happens to his friends? Like, where's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We really don't know. It never says, right? Some people just assume that because of the age of Daniel, this has been 60 years, that these guys may just have actually have died by this time and they're not around. Here's something else that's important to know. That Daniel, we recognize from what is said here in these verses, that Daniel has been raised, again, in a pagan culture to a place of high position and rule. Now pay attention to that. Let me ask you this question. What can you get in a godless government and godless culture if you have a position of power? The answer is anything your heart desires, right? I mean, if you have a position of power like Daniel does, and he is living in a godless culture, you can get anything you want. And if you have a bad day, if you become vulnerable, if you have temptation, all of a sudden you think, wow, she looks good, or he looks good, or I think I need extra money, you can pull a lever. You can find a way to get. People will get you what you believe you need. That's important. You know what this means? If you see this in a sports event, what's this mean? This means, you guys not watching sports? This means the 4th quarter. This is the 4th quarter. And sometimes you'll watch football games, and guys will get the end of the 3rd quarter, and all of a sudden, everybody does this. And here's what it means. It's not just like it's the 4th quarter. Oh, we all know that. That means this. It's the 4th quarter. We're all tired. We're give out. We don't have much left. We've got to finish strong. This means we've got to finish strong. Daniel is in a place in his life. He has been exalted to a position of leadership and influence. No doubt in this godless culture, he has been surrounded by all kinds of temptation, all kinds of things that would make a man vulnerable. And I believe this is very, very vital, what we are watching, not only for people who may be relatively new in their faith today, but also for us who are in the 4th quarter of our lives. We need to make sure we finish well. One of my favorite leaders in the kingdom, Christian kingdom, in the last 25 or 30 years is a guy by the name of Bill Hybels. You know who Bill Hybels is? Some of you may not, some of you may. Bill Hybels was the pastor at a church called Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago. He founded the church right out of college. And then he stayed pastor at that church. Willow Creek became one of the largest churches in our country and probably, undoubtedly, one of the most influential churches in the entire world. And he became probably one of the top 5 most influential Christian leaders in the world in the 90s. He wrote a book called Courageous Leadership. It is one of my favorite books on leadership. He spells it out well, and one of the best chapters is one on self-leadership. He says self-leadership is the most important and the most difficult. And he spells out well why we have to be careful as leaders in the 4th quarter of our life to make sure that we stay living a life of trustworthiness and integrity with our faith. Several years ago, Bill Hybels had to step out of his position just in the last 2 or 3. His positions and roles of influence in the kingdom because he had been accused a number of times of sexual harassment and inappropriate sexual misconduct by several women that he knew and that he worked with. Folks, whether you're young or whether you're in the last quarter, we got to finish strong. And Daniel 6 is about, if it's about anything, it is about what it takes to ready ourselves to maintain the disciplines in our life to finish strong. It sets up and says that these other people around him are jealous of him, and so they try to find some kind of a place in his character that they can attack. But he's trustworthy and he's responsible. He does what he's supposed to do. And so basically they just say, hey, all we know to do is to attack his faith. And so they begin to come up with this idea, this scheme that basically says, hey, we're going to catch him. We're going to go to the king and say, you can't, let's sign a law that nobody else can pray to anybody but you. And if anybody's caught doing that, they're going to be thrown in the lion's den. What do you think, Darius? They catch Darius on a bad day. Maybe he's prone to flattery. I don't know. And he goes, that sounds like a good idea. Anybody who is found praying to anybody else or bowing down to anybody else will be thrown in the lion's den. And he signs it. And there's this law of the Medes and Persians that says once a law is signed, you can't do anything else about it. It's in concrete. So that's the situation. And Daniel finds out about this situation. Now, let me remind you that Daniel 4:6-4 says he was faithful, and he was always responsible, and he was completely trustworthy. And that's why they went after him. And it reminds me, this whole setup of these guys around him, it reminds me of when Peter writes his first letter, and he says this, but even if you suffer for doing what is right, God will reward you for it. So don't worry or be afraid of their threats. Instead, you must worship Christ as Lord of your life. Folks, before we go on, I want to make sure you're with me, okay? I want to make sure that you're buckled in and that you're paying attention, because I believe that what we're getting ready to look at is seriously life-changing. And it's some stuff that we've talked about, and it comes up in the Word all the time. And I've told you before, it's my heart for you all, and even more than that, it's God's heart for you. So this is stuff I want to make sure that you're leaning in on. See, Daniel's in this alone situation. And what Daniel's getting ready to reveal to us in these next few verses, as he writes this book, he is going to reveal to us the actual tools and practices that he had with him and that he was doing to make sure that he did not tap out. And it wasn't just for the dramatic moment coming up for that this lion's den thing. But it was also looking back for the draining days, that leadership role that he was in that was a pressure cooker role where people were taking shots at him. See, we think sometimes leadership is all about privilege. And when I meet people who think leadership is all about privilege, I realize they've never really been in leadership. Because anybody who's been in a role of leadership knows there's a tremendous pressure cooker in leadership. There's tremendous responsibility that you feel for others in leadership. There's decisions all the time to be made. You don't step aside. And that's what Daniel's in. And not only is he in a role of leadership, he's in a role of leadership in a pagan culture. And so what we're going to see here is we're going to see what Daniel is doing to prepare and to be ready and the tools he's taken. Daniel 6, verse 10. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and he knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with his windows open towards Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house, and they found him praying and asking for God's help. Here's the tools that Daniel packed in his bag. Here's what he does, his training regimen. 1, at this point in time, when he finds out about this, Daniel goes home. He goes home. Now, what's the significance of that? It's not that there's any particular spatialness about his home. But a question would have to be is, when we feel the pressure cooker, when we feel life has been unfair, when we feel like somebody's trying to kick the legs out from underneath us, what is it that you do first? Where do you go, or who do you go to? See, again, the significance wasn't in Daniel's home. The significance was this, in him going home. That home was the place where he went to God. Home was a place. When we talk about us building a time in our life when we are being with God, I will tell you, folks, place is vital. Because that place, in its own way, as you have conversations with God, will become a holy place. It will be a place that you long for. It will be a place that has significance in your life. Naming a place is vital. Can you talk to God anywhere? Absolutely. But I'm telling you, place is important. I used to play racquetball a little bit. I was not very good, but I had a guy who taught me to play some racquetball, and he was actually the state champion for a couple years, and he would beat me all the time, like 13-0, 13-0. Sometimes I'd have a little bit better game, and he beat me 13-0. And one day he just kind of said, "Hey, Steve," he said, "here, let me show you something." He didn't work on my swing. Here's what he showed me. He said, "I'm going to show you where to stand." Now, where he showed me to stand was kind of a dangerous place because it was basically in the line of fire. At that moment, when I began to stand right there, my racquetball game went up significantly because it put me in a position to continue to play the ball. And before I had been out of position. Folks, listen, the placement in sports is vital. Where you are at on the field, where you are at on the court, and position in our spiritual life, the place is an important thing. I've told you, I have a couple places in my life, and they're places I go for my time with Jesus on a regular basis. He went home and he went to God. He knelt down, it says. And then it adds this, he knelt down as usual. Now, I told you that place is important, but I want to share with you this. I believe when he says he knelt down, I don't believe he just knelt down because he was in a dangerous place. It says he knelt down as usual. When I was playing ball when I was growing up, my dad would coach, and he would tell us, he would always say, when he got ready to hit grounders to us or do infield work, he'd always say, "Guys, are you ready?" And we'd all be standing out there, 9 and 10-year-olds, "Yeah, I'm ready." And he would proceed to hit a ground ball, and he'd go right by us before we ever even saw it. Well, we soon begin to realize that ready is this. Ready means that your knees are bent and wide, and you're ready to receive the ball. And if the ball goes left or right, you can move either way, and you're ready to take that ground ball, or move into a place to take a pop-up or something. If Dad knew that you weren't ready, he just hit a ball right by you to prove you weren't ready. Readiness almost is the same in every sport, football, basketball, baseball, whatever. It's having your knees bent, ready to be involved. In other words, and if you don't, you've got to actually bend your knees before you do anything else, right? So you're not ready. Daniel was ready. He had taught himself to kneel. Let me tell you about something about kneeling. Does kneeling make us more spiritual? No. Kneeling can be at times when our hearts are heavy, when our hearts are broken. Kneeling can be a reflection of where our heart is. But sometimes our hearts are proud and we are confident and we really don't believe we need this time with God. We probably don't need his help at all. We've got this, thank you. Kneeling is not only a reflection of my heart, friends, and your heart. Kneeling and bowing before God leads my heart to the throne. Kneeling prepares your heart. Kneeling reminds you that he is God and that you are not. And Daniel is a man who's the second most in command in the entire Babylon. And maybe there's times he has come and he has been proud and he didn't want to kneel. He didn't feel like kneel because he could get what he wanted, but he has taught himself to kneel. And when we kneel, our heart is led into the presence of God. And when we kneel, we learn to say, God, I need you. I need you. Place is important, and posture and position is important. And when we kneel, folks, it is not us trying to prove to God or ourselves or anybody else that we are more spiritual. Matter of fact, I believe kneeling says this. No, I recognize my own unspirituality. I recognize that I'm not a good person. When people came to Jesus for healing, when they came to him for forgiveness, read in the Gospels time and time again. What do? Is they run to Jesus. They run to him and they kneel. They bow down. They fall on their face before Jesus. He knelt as usual. And then it says, with his windows open towards Jerusalem. Now, that's an interesting thing. A lot has been made about with his windows open towards Jerusalem. Like, well, that he had kept his windows open and these guys could see him praying. And that's a point. I don't think it's the main point. He kept his windows open towards Jerusalem. Why? Because to the Jew, which Daniel was, Jerusalem was a place of promise. The Jews knew that they had been exiled because of disobedience. They had been brought to Babylon because of disobedience. But God promised them through the other prophets that there would be a day when they would return to their home. And we are promised. When you look in the book of Hebrews, you find this. It says this, of these people in the Old Testament like Daniel, by faith, these people overthrew kingdoms. They ruled with justice. They received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions. Wonder who that's talking about. They quenched the flames of fire. Wonder who that's talking about. And they escaped death by the edge of the sword. And then, if you move down just a few sentences, it says this. How did these people do what they did? How did they close the mouths of lions? How did they quench the flames? How did they undergo what they went through? Let us run with endurance the race God has set before us, the writer says, just a few sentences down. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, who is the champion, who initiates and perfects our faith. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's place. See, they are promised Jerusalem. And that's why his windows were open. So in a sense, he could see Jerusalem, even though it was 1,600 miles away. We can endure the draining days, and you and I can endure the lion's den that will come our way when we keep our hearts and our eyes on the place of promise. We will receive, as believers, the new Jerusalem. When we forget, or when we remember, I should say, that we are aliens, strangers here, and that we are created for a much better place, we keep our eyes ahead on what has been promised. It was not only a place of promise, but it was a place of his presence, because the temple was there. And at the time, the temple did not, or that the Spirit did not dwell in the hearts of man. But the temple was there, and the temple represented what? The presence of God. And so Daniel had his windows open so he could be reminded of the promise. There will be a day when I return home, and there will be a day when I will be in the presence of God. 400 years before that, David would write this. Amidst all the enemies that surround him, about those who were trying to kill him, he says, I desire one thing, that I might dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and to seek him in the temple. When all the stuff was going on, when the draining days were happening, when the lion's den awaited him, what he wanted was simply to be in the presence of God. And so he kept his windows open to be reminded of that symbolic place where he could be in God's presence. And not only that, it says that Daniel prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done. 3 times a day. Folks, man, so often when we start talking about pulling aside to spend time with God, I'm amazed at how often I hear people say, well, I know I should, but I'm just really busy. Do you think, as a second highest in command in the entire country, that Daniel might have had some people knocking on his door? That Daniel might have had some people demanding his time? That Daniel probably had a lot of meetings and a lot of appointments and didn't have a cell phone so he could just take care of those things like this? This is a man who's got an incredible amount of things going on in his life, and yet he carved out time 3 times a day to return to his house so he could come into the presence of God to be ready for those draining days in an up-and-coming lion's den. See, Daniel had wisely built the habit of going into God's presence consistently and intentionally. Have you and I done that? Have you built that time of where you are making yourself ready for the draining day so you, in your vulnerability, you do not fall, you do not fold? He was ready. He was ready. And folks, listen, we have those draining days. If you're a grandparent raising children, you have those draining days. If you're a single parent, you have those draining days. If you have bills, you have those draining days. You've got someone who would love your attention, and you'd love to give them your attention, except the only problem is you're not married to them. You have those draining days when a child or a partner gets sick, and there's no explanation, and they're not getting better, and you become vulnerable, or you become vulnerable to some type of temptation. Are we doing the things in our life as Daniel was? Building those things into our life where we are coming into God's presence so we are ready for that. One of the books that I'm reading with some of our young leaders is a book by Ruth Haley Barton, and she says this: the chaos of the human soul will settle if it sits long enough. See, here's what I'm saying. Is that tomorrow, if you said, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to begin to have a time of quietness, a time of abiding, I'm going to do what Daniel did and begin to ready myself, I would tell you that it'd be hard, probably. It may not even be enjoyable. Because you're used to going, you're used to running, you're used to putting a check mark next to something, getting something done. And everything in your soul and body and mind is going to be going, I need to be doing something. And it's going to be hard, it's going to be awkward and feel weird, maybe even wrong. But over time, if you continue to sit there, if you continue to read his word, if you continue to learn how to converse with him and become more comfortable with that, it will become over time a time that you look forward to. It will become the best moments of your day. And you will come to a place where you can't imagine going through the day without it. And the goal, friends, of that time is always this. It's always to eliminate everything that will believe that will keep us from believing God utterly. And the goal is always to eliminate everything that will keep you and I from loving God with our hearts completely. That's the goal. Well, there's the rest of the story. And I'm going to let a little girl named Colby tell you the rest of the story.
Once upon a time, there was a little man named Daniel. And Daniel and the king said, if you don't pay to the king, then you will be thrown in the lion's dungeon.
Ooh, that seems scary.
And Daniel prayed to his God and got in the then the mean wise man used to be good, but then a bad guy turned him bad. Wise man.
Okay.
And mean wise man. And then they went to the base to see if everyone prayed to their king, but everyone in the town prayed to Daniel's God. But then the mean wise man threw everyone into the lion's den.
Everybody got thrown into the lion's den, or just Daniel?
I think it was just Daniel.
You think it was just Daniel? Okay. So they threw Daniel into the lion's den for praying to God.
Yeah, and then a bright light appeared, and Daniel saw the bright light, and then it was an angel, and then the angel closed all the lion's mouth so they won't eat Daniel.
Oh my goodness. Then what happened?
And then when the king and the mean wise man was gonna see what was left of Daniel, and his whole body was there.
And he was alive.
Yeah.
And then what did they say?
I don't remember.
They couldn't believe he hadn't been eaten up by the lions, right?
Yeah.
And so they said, you can pray to your God. Is that what they said?
I think so.
I think so. That was a really good job.
Yeah, that's good. Now, if you're reading your Bible and you're not finding the part about the angel and the really bright light, that would be the KDV, the Kobe dramatic version. All right, okay, but I'm sure it happened that way. And aren't we all glad that his whole body was there and not just parts of his body were there? I'm not sure we got that, but it's good stuff. Folks, we're all going to have our draining days. Life can be draining. We'll all have something happen. Something unexpected will happen in our marriage. We'll get a bill that we weren't expecting. We'll have a temptation that will just sneak up on us. Sometimes lions are in dens, and sometimes they are prowling around us just in our daily life. We have those draining days, right? And every one of us is going to have, if we have not had before, we will have a lion's den moment. I've had them. Sometimes you see them coming, sometimes you don't. But you know it's a lion's den moment. I was reading this book called The Secret Gift that happened in the Depression. I never really thought about the fact that there were literally people who had been the richest man in town, who owned factories, who were millionaires in the 30s. And within half a year, they were standing in line begging for a piece of bread for their family. Lion's Den moments. Several weeks ago, we talked with you about Tyler and Sevie Davison, a young couple that we began to support so they could go and do mission work in Japan. And we shared with you with broken hearts a couple weeks ago that Sevie had been killed in a head-on accident right before they were getting ready to go and get on a plane and begin mission work for the kingdom in Japan. This week I talked to a good friend of mine, a brother in this church. who last week took his wife to the hospital just because she was in pain with what they felt like was a simple UTI. And within days had realized that she has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The lion's den. It's the lion's den. A temptation that you may not see coming, or something that tests your faith. And I have to ask you, folks, are you doing in your life what is necessary? Have you packed the tools? Have you established the habits? Are the patterns there for you to be ready for the draining day and the lion's den? Because Jim said it very, very well last week. Sometimes we get believing when we read this story that all of a sudden we can just, when it comes, we'll be ready. That we'll have some type of spiritual muscle or courage or bravery that we really haven't worked on. We just assume it's going to be there. It was there for Daniel. The integrity in the draining days and the courage in the lion's den, because he had established in his life the tools and the habits and the patterns. So he had God's presence in him and with him. He was able to operate in faith. Sometimes when we're doing New Year's resolutions, it always kind of cracks me up that somebody on December 12th will say, hey, man, on January 1st, I'm going to buckle down. I'm going to start dieting. I'm going to start working out. I'm going to start, or whatever the habit is, on January 1st, 2.5 or 3 weeks later, they're going to buckle down. They're going to start doing the right thing. And I always want to ask myself, so you're just going to continue doing the unhealthy or wrong thing for 3 weeks? That doesn't sound like repentance to me. That doesn't sound like you're really very serious about changing things. So as your brother in Jesus, I got to ask you, are you ready? Are you building into your life the habits and the patterns, time with God that will prepare you for draining days in the lion's den? And if not, when are you going to start making a change? When are you going to build to be for beginners? When are you going to build that 10 or 15 minutes into your life so that you can just sit down in quietness and be in the Word and begin to learn how to converse with God? When is that going to happen? You're going to wait 2 or 3 more weeks? You're going to continue in the unhealthy spiritual life that you're at? Or you're going to begin and realize that you're going to do it? I'm going to tell you now. You will do it and you will lose. And it won't feel right. Just be ready for that. And you've got to go back and finish well. You've got to keep plugging well. You've got to keep setting yourself down. You've got to put that chair in front of you and know that Jesus is there waiting for you. He is ready for you to have that conversation, to begin that habit, to come into his presence. Just want to give you, just before as we close, I want to give you a couple practical things to do. One, there's a tremendous app called the 1 Minute Pause that's been developed by a guy by the name of John Eldridge. And this has been specifically developed. So several times during the day, it will remind you, and it will give you like a verse, just like a 1 minute thing. And so you can take the things that are in your heart and your mind and give them over and release them back to God. And then maybe a few hours later, it will remind you again. 1 minute pause. Some of the pauses are 1 minute if you're just a beginner. As you get kind of grow through it, those pauses go to 3 and 7 and 10 minutes. You can set it up the way you want to and how often you want it to remind you. It is a great practical way to begin to build his presence into your life throughout the day. Find a place. Find a place. Put a chair there and just know that Jesus is waiting expectantly. Find a time. Because if you looked at my day planner, every day at a certain time, you will see written into my planner, abiding. I am with God during this time. I don't take calls. I try not to be distracted by anything else. I write it in, and it's an appointment that I have with him that will not be broken. In the same way, if I make an appointment with you, it will not be broken except for an emergency. It's that important to me. And if you don't write it in your schedule, everything else will flow into it, and it'll be swept away. Find a place, find a time. Begin to be ready. John 17, at the end of Jesus' ministry and at the end of his life, he says this is the way to have eternal life, to know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, the one you sent to earth. Man, brothers and sisters, Jesus wants to know you. He wants to know you. And he waits expectantly. If you've received him in your life, he waits in the chair, and he's waiting to have that conversation so he can build your faith, and so he can build the spiritual muscle and build the trust to ready you for the draining day in the lion's den. If you've never received in your life, he waits at the door and he says, I knock and I knock. He's waiting for you to open that door and have the first conversation that says, Jesus, I need you. I know, son. I know, daughter. I have and I am what you need. He is waiting for you. My friends, are you ready? Are we ready? Let's begin. Let's begin building what we need into our life. Be ready for those days and when the lion's den comes. Let's stand and respond to God, his mercy and his grace.